Another major component when we're talking about the cardiovascular system is blood itself. So we're going to do a quick summary of what blood is and what it does for us. So first of all, we can see in this that blood is broken up into two things, plasma and formed elements. But what we want to do before we talk about what's in the plasma and what's the formed elements is let's discuss what does blood do for us in the first place. What's its function? So blood basically has 5 major functions. They're listed here. I'm going to briefly talk about each of them, and you can go back and read through the notes and through the book and anything else that you want to read about it. But the first thing that blood does, which is probably the most obvious thing that we think about, is it's a transportation system. It actually circulates through the body. It really connects. We know blood is a connective tissue, and we know that blood connects basically all parts of the body. So how do we get something from one part of the body to the other? Well, blood carries it. So we're going to transport things like our dissolved gases. Oxygen's probably the main thing we think about, but we know there's also carbon dioxide and even nitrogen and other things that aren't quite as important as oxygen and carbon dioxide. But it does dissolve different gases, or excuse me, it does transport different dissolved gases in the body. The whole reason why we eat is so we can send nutrients to our cells, because that's where they're actually used. So how do we get it from our digestive system to our cells? Well, our blood carries it there. Hormones, by definition, are these chemicals that are carried in our blood to cause changes in our body. And of course, we produce wastes in the body, especially at the cellular level. So how are we going to get those wastes away from the cells and eventually out of the body? Well, we're going to have to transport them through our blood. Okay, the next thing that is super important, we probably don't talk about it quite as much, but it's an extremely important function, is we actually have to regulate our pH. One of our homeostatic values in our body is our pH level, and we know that our pH level could become too high or too low. There's a range that has to be maintained, and our blood helps regulate that range, and it does it through primarily how it handles the formation of carbon dioxide into something called bicarbonate ion, and it also blood also absorbs lactic acid from our muscles. So our blood does maintain a slightly alkaline pH, about 7.35 to 7.45 for arterial blood gases. So we normally say it's about 7.4. All right, and then, of course, another thing, if you've had any experience, which you all should have by now, talking about physiology, then we're primarily talking about, a lot of times, about how electrolytes are moving from, outside of a cell into a cell. So to maintain the correct electrolyte composition, the amount of sodium, the amount of potassium, the amount of calcium, all those things that our body needs to physiologically function, then our blood is going to help regulate how much of that we need. And of course, the blood determines what's in the interstitial fluid, because we know that the capillaries is actually where the contents of the blood leak out to the cellular areas and the interstitial fluids around the cells. So regulating our pH and electrolyte, again, just as important as our dissolved gases and stuff. Both of these make life possible. All right, another thing, I'm going to go ahead and skip down here, stabilization of our body temperature. We know our muscles are the primary source of generating heat, but our blood is kind of like a radiator. It actually distributes that heat throughout the body. We know that if we get too hot, then the blood vessels tend to dilate. The blood, because of evaporative cooling, actually, and the hydrogen bonds in the water in the blood pick up that heat and then distribute it throughout the body. And even if we're too hot, it even causes it to transfer that heat across the body as we lose sweat. Now, if we're too cool, then our blood vessels tend to constrict, and we tend to try to get the blood in the core and more important areas such as our brain. And of course, this keeps our sensitive organs warm enough to be able to function. So stabilizing our body temperature, extremely important function of the blood. Again, another homeostatic function of the blood. All right, now, another thing the blood has the ability to do, and it's actually a complicated process with several cascades involved, and we're going to talk a little bit more detail about this a little bit later, and you're going to do an activity where you're going to at least be introduced to these concepts, is the blood having the ability to restrict the fluid loss through several things that happen, and of course we call this blood clotting. So, if we didn't have this ability, then if we were injured, we would probably die in a very short time, because if we don't have the ability to clot the blood, then we're going to lose it, and without blood, we would not be able to survive. Okay, then the last thing I wanted to mention is blood contains several things that actually help us in our immune system, and so I talk about it last because this actually is what will be our natural transition from test 1 material dealing with cardiovascular to test 2 material dealing with immunity. So one of the things that probably blood has is things called white blood cells, leukocytes. Now there are several different types of leukocytes. We're going to talk about them and their functions, what they do. But not only does blood have leukocytes, it also has proteins in it called antibodies. And these proteins, you've probably been hearing a lot due to the current health crisis about the antibodies. And antibodies are proteins that are actually developed from something called plasma B cells. And they're very specific for what they're able to bind to and neutralize, and all the things that it does for health. We'll talk about those things a little bit later also. All right, but we also even have proteins in our blood called complement proteins. Most people aren't as familiar with them, but they're a major way that we actually help fight bacteria, and they also complement what antibodies are doing for us. That's part of why they're called complement proteins. However, we'll be going over those in great detail, probably more than you ever wanted to know, but hopefully if you're going in the medical field, you want to know as much as possible. So these are the functions of blood. So now let's talk about the types of, what is blood actually made up of, and what are the living cells in blood. So first of all, let's break down blood into its components. Okay, so blood is a connective tissue, as we talked about last semester. Okay, connective tissues are broken down into living cells, specialized living cells, and something called a matrix. And the matrix is broken down into protein and some sort of ground substance. Well, we can see that blood falls into this category very well. Our living cells in blood are called the formed elements. These are going to be several different cells. Here in this picture, our main cell found there are our erythrocytes, or red blood cells. And then other cells would be things like our white blood cells, and even fragments of white blood cells called platelets. Okay, but then the matrix of blood is what we would call plasma, and plasma has a ground substance that's called water, which makes up the majority of the plasma. 92% of the plasma is actually water, and then the other component of the matrix are the plasma proteins, or the proteins for plasma proteins for blood, but proteins just for any connective tissue. Okay, now, but back to this. So first of all, notice we do have a percentage scale here. So obviously, if you understand that all of blood would be 100% of blood, then if 46% of blood happens to be plasma, then that means 54% of it would have to be the formed elements. If 63% of the blood is plasma, then 37% of the blood would be formed elements. Now, this is a range because we know the body has ranges that it can exist in. And so what would be the main reason this range would exist would be how hydrated are you? How much water is in your blood? If you've just been out, exercising, running a marathon or something, and you've lost a lot of body fluid, then your plasma concentration is going to be down in the lower end. And therefore, your hematocrit, or your formed elements portion, would be in a higher end percentage-wise. Now, if you've just really hydrated yourself, and of course you can have too little water in you and too much water in you, but if you've hydrated yourself to where it's not unhealthy, and you're fully hydrated, then your plasma is probably going to have be the 63% range, where your formed elements would then be 37% range. But primarily, what controls this is primarily the amount of water. Now, sometimes there are conditions that cause people to maybe make too many or too little red blood cells, and that can also be a factor in this. But under normal conditions, it's primarily under the percentage of water that you would have. So let's look at the plasma portion first, and notice again, out of the plasma, if we add these up, that's 100% of the plasma, not of the whole blood, but of the plasma. So 92% of plasma is water, so by far water is the most important thing in blood. But then we also have our other component, our plasma proteins, which we're going to talk about, and then finally the 1%. Now, the 1% may be like, well, it's just 1%, but that's really the purpose of blood. So our 1% is the whole purpose of blood, so we'll talk about it last as we talk about plasma composition. All right, so water's the main component of plasma, but then our 7% of plasma is made up of proteins. Now again, if I add these up, I'm going to get 100% of the proteins. So by far, we have more albumin than any other type of protein. And the biggest thing about albumin is albumin gives us the correct amount of osmotic pressure. So if you remember our discussion on tonicity last semester, where we said, you know, something can either be isotonic, hypotonic, or hypertonic, albumin tends to be the main thing that keeps the plasma of our blood, and our blood in general, keeps it isotonic. So we don't want a bunch of water rushing into our red blood cells or rushing out of our red blood cells. So we need a certain amount of particles that's found in the blood that keeps it isotonic. Because remember, osmosis says water runs from a high concentration to a low concentration. So if I didn't have enough albumin, that means I would have a higher water concentration, and therefore water would tend to want to run into my red blood cells and cause them to go through hemolysis. If I had too much, so let's say I had a bunch of sodium and chloride in my blood, then what would happen is that would lower my water concentration, and therefore water would run out of my red blood cells and cause them to basically shrivel or shrink, something called crenation. All right, so albumin is that particle found in the plasma of the blood that's primarily responsible for osmotic pressure, so we can keep an isotonic solution in our blood. Okay, now, and then there's some other things that it does. Transport lipids. Notice that. So it not only transport lipids, but it also can transport steroid hormones, which again are specific hormones with a specific chemical derivative, which we'll talk about later on. All right, so albumin, again, the most important thing is the major contributor to the osmotic pressure. Our next highest percentage of plasma proteins are our globulins. Now again, just like these transport lipids and steroid hormones, globulins help transport ions and hormones and lipids. So again, transporting stuff in the blood is extremely important. But the more important thing the thing I want to emphasize more on this is something that we call immunoglobulins, and you'll see them with designators like IgG, IgA, IgM, IgD, IgG. Immunoglobulins is another name for antibodies. So antibodies is basically what helps us in immunity. So we have a high percentage of globulins, and a lot of those are going to be our antibodies. So again, that's an immune function. Without antibodies, we would probably not survive too many infections. Okay, we have a plasma protein called fibrinogen, and it actually is something that is converted from a fluid type into an insoluble type. Okay, so we can't have a soluble or an insoluble thing floating around in our blood, so it has to be actually soluble as fibrinogen, but it also needs to be converted into an insoluble strand called fibrin, so it can actually be used to help clot. Now, there's a cascade of events that does this for us, so it's basically part of our clotting process that we're going to go over later. But this is extremely important that you understand. Fibrinogen is in a fluid nature and is converted to a insoluble form called fibrin to help us clot our blood. Okay, next is our regulatory proteins, enzymes and proenzymes. Hopefully you understand the importance of those in any chemical reaction. And then hormones that are actually protein-based hormones are also going to be part of our plasma proteins.